I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on the Spotlight Network, we're uncovering a shocking, untold part of history that has shaped modern America. He's out with a groundbreaking book, Freedom to Discriminate, and we're talking to housing expert Gene Slater. In the book, he reveals how realtors played a pivotal role in segregating communities, influencing policy, and redefining the very concept of freedom in America. This eye-opening expose connects real estate practices to today's political and social divisions, making it a must-read for anyone who wants to understand how we got here. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today, and we ask viewers like you to support authors like him by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing his amazing book. The links are below this interview. And be sure to download the Spotlight Network TV app, streaming on Roku, Apple TV, and Amazon Fire TV. Gene, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you.
What struck your interest about realtors and segregation that you decided to write a book? Are you a realtor? Are you familiar with the industry?
No.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so my background has been in financing affordable housing. For 50 years, I helped create one of the leading firms that advises on all types of affordable housing around the United States, from redeveloping old public housing projects to single-family homes for home buyers. During the Great Recession in 2009, I laid out the approach that Treasury used to finance homes for 110,000 first-time home buyers in the midst of the recession. So I've worked in about 30 states and have seen all kinds of issues. And one of the things that struck me is city after city, the patterns of where people live are almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
You know, an inner core, a ghetto, a transitional neighborhood, largely still today, largely all white suburbs, areas of disinvestment. And these patterns seem so common, identical. If you go to Milwaukee, you go to Seattle, you go almost anywhere, that you took them as natural. I took them as natural, as this is the way things always were. This is the way things had to be. This was the norm. And that wasn't the case. And at the same time, so that was my background. At the same time, I was taking a graduate seminar in human rights at Stanford. And I found myself asking the question, why on every issue involving human rights, civil rights, and kinds of rights, what liberals or progressives saw as an extension and expansion of rights were seen by conservatives as an attack on American freedom, as violating the fundamental individual freedom. And where did that come about? How did that arise? Has that always been the case, that these very opposite meanings? And what I found was the connection between these two defining features of modern America. There's the creation of housing segregation in every city in the country in virtually the same way. And this idea of American freedom created in the 1960s to oppose fair housing and the civil rights movement. And that you know, the idea that freedom doesn't belong to the country, it belongs to you as your personal property. And somebody else being free or having rights violates your own. A notion that has shifted America to the right for 60 years. So these seem like two fundamental features of the country, and it turns out they were both created by the same organization.
Yeah. You know what? I grew up in the 60s, 70s, and of course beyond. In the 70s, at a PSA, a public service announcement, where a couple would ask the realtor, are there any black families in this neighborhood? And the realtor replied, oh no, you don't have to worry about them. And then the couple looks at each other, they're upset, and they leave. So that was kind of a public awareness thing that I recall back in the 70s to get realtors to stop this behavior of steering white families to white neighborhoods and black families to black neighborhoods. Do you think those efforts were successful at all, or do you think that there are still realtors who are giving, in perhaps code language, you don't want to live here or you do want to live there, that kind of thing?
I mean, there's certainly all sorts of informal mechanisms. I mean, fair housing in 1968 prohibited formal segregation and prohibited saying those kinds of words.
Right.
Um, but in reality, America still is largely segregated, and it's partly due to actions of individuals, of whether it's particular realtors. There's an excellent story in Newsday and Long Island Divided about that, looking today at neighborhood after neighborhood. It's also appraisers. And there have been lots of stories in the New York Times and Washington Post about appraisers discriminating. It's banks who turn down African Americans with the same credit scores and income at twice the rate they turn down whites. So that persists, but it's a much broader set of legacies from the history of formal
Yeah.
segregation that shaped the country and that would have taken powerful government action to overcome. And what prevented that was precisely this idea of freedom that has shifted the country politically to where it is today.
Yeah. The issue also lies with zoning as well. I mean, I find zoning extremely discriminatory. You know, you go to Greenwich, Connecticut, and the zoning for a house will be 5 acres. You know,
Right.
so obviously, right there, you've precluded anyone who's a working person, anyone who's truly middle
Yeah.
class from living in that community. So you're creating these rich, largely white enclaves, and other people are sometimes put into what might be described as a ghetto.
So two answers to that, I think. One is that zoning was a tool first created and promoted all over the country by the realtors. By the realtors, I mean the official real estate boards, now the National Association of Realtors, that in each city, who only originally were only a small percentage of all the brokers, but through their multiple listing service controlled 80% of home sales in the country, and they could freeze out any broker who violated their rules. Their rules included not selling to a minority in an all-white neighborhood, their code of ethics in 1924. And to support, they originally began, you know where segregation began in this country, where the first segregated neighborhoods were? It was a mile from the University of California campus in Berkeley. It wasn't in the South. And it
Wow.
was created to support high-end subdivisions, the kinds of places you're describing,
Mm.
to which they said you have to maintain street trees, we have curving streets, you can't turn your house into a rental or a funeral parlor. Brother, it was a time before zoning.
Mm.
And they added to this list of covenants one other that said, and you can't sell your home to a non-Caucasian, which meant Jews, blacks, Chinese, Japanese, Italians, Russians, Turks, Japanese, Chinese. It meant a whole wide band of everybody who the realtors saw. And this was a marketing device. This was intended to help them sell homes. And it's very quickly spread. But to support these racial covenants, the Supreme Court finally said you can't use in 19, or can enforce in 1948. To support these, they created zoning. The first single family zoning in the United States was also created in Berkeley by the same realtor developer, Duncan McDuffie. And there was a Black African American dance hall that was being proposed like a mile from his subdivision. So he said, we can't allow that. So he created the first single family zoning in America, one that's come and was used to support racial covenants and racial steering and all these other tools. So you wind up, and this is what I deal with today all over the country in terms of housing unaffordability, this device of single family zoning and exclusive zoning. It was implemented by creating separate suburbs to enforce those, to have their own planning rules to prevent any builder from selling to minorities. So you have much of the shape of America today, and it's um, and the prices of homes and what's happened over the last 50 years comes out of this legacy.
Mm.
So I think that that's sort of an essential part of the story.
Yeah, yeah, and it's true when it comes to racial divide, and like you said, it also is true when it comes to affordability. I mean, if these zoning laws allowed people to rent spaces in their home, apartments within their home, build another unit on their property, the affordable housing crisis could be ended in a matter of a decade, I would think. And it's some of the most liberal areas of America are the ones that are opposed to changing the zoning laws.
Right.
Yeah,
Right. At the local level, sometimes at the state level, Massachusetts a few years ago, California to a limited extent, have sort of created tools to override um, a community which has totally single family zoning.
yeah,
But and even in Texas, Republican legislators have been wrestling with this issue.
yeah,
So I think it's a national issue that affects everybody. I mean, housing segregation didn't only impact those it excluded. It impacts everyone because the realtors, along with racial covenants, they were the shaping force of FHA, Federal Housing Administration,
right.
um, that then created the redlining maps and so forth. And it created, as one of the rules of FHA, was you couldn't get approved for a new development, a new subdivision, if it was potentially if minorities might live there.
Mm.
And so you had to create these physically separate all white suburbs. So the neighborhoods where almost every American lives today, and all the metropolitan areas were created and designed, and the highway system, the infrastructure built
Mm.
to establish this. So where you live, who your neighbors are, this in many ways comes out as one of the legacies and affects everybody. Plus, it affects, as I'm saying, um, the politics of the country and
Yeah.
the basic belief systems that are in contention.
Yeah. There's no integration. Segregation is perpetuated because you don't get to know people from different cultures, different ethnicities, different races, different backgrounds. Schools are impacted as well. You have all black schools in many cases and all white
Right,
schools in other cases, sometimes even within the same town, depending on
right,
the different neighborhood barriers, right? And that impacts education.
right. It isn't as uniform as it once was. I mean, there is some dispersal of people, but it's still a fundamental pattern at the basics.
Yeah. And that is a driving force for many people in their housing decisions also. Where is the best school district?
Sure,
And
that's one of the ways that segregation is reinforced is the realtor will answer that question. Well, look at school test scores, and there'll be
right.
lots of websites, and so you have self-segregation occurring. There's lots of mechanisms.
Yeah. What are some of the answers to solving this problem? It is entrenched. I mean, talk about systemic racism. If our very neighborhoods and the places where we live, if our cities and towns are divided by race because of a history of realtors and racist people choosing to, basically redline
Mm.
America, how do you solve this, particularly in an era where, the left and the right are at each other's throats?
I can describe a couple of approaches. I mean, one is there's an issue of individual discrimination, as I meant, appraisers, lenders, banks, um, uh, brokers, and all of them have licenses. Um, if the penalty for violating these rules was you lose your license, you have to close down that branch or you have to close down the bank. Can no longer be a real estate broker. You can no longer be an appraiser. If those penalties were enforced, that would change a lot of the individual behavior, the informal behavior.
Mm.
But the broader issues are this overwhelming legacy through zoning, fiscal zoning, separate suburbs, um, the differences in household wealth. that were created during the 60 years when blacks effectively couldn't buy homes. They couldn't get an FHA loan. They couldn't get a VA loan. They couldn't get loans from banks who had the same redlining maps. Um, that that impact, that difference in household wealth in the 1940s and 50s has only compounded today. I mean, back at that time, house prices in real terms were a fifth of what they are today.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. And so that difference in household wealth and what you pass on to your children and their ability to buy homes has only compounded over time. Um, so a couple of things, I'll mention one program that I helped work on was for California, 2 years ago, worked with the legislature and the treasurer's office to help create a program called California Dream for All that would provide large shared appreciation second mortgages to help people buy $200,000, $300,000 second mortgages to help people, um, moderate income people buy homes in a very almost impossible real estate market. And one of the questions was, well, some of the legislatures, well, we want to promote, racial equity and, you know, um, give more opportunities. Question is, you can't do that under California's constitution. You can't have any program that positively, supports any racial group. So I said, why don't we instead simply make the program a lottery? This is like $1 billion program. There's going to be enormous demand, however much money we do this. And this isn't the state, this is not a subsidy program. This is the state creating an investment fund to co-invest with people to buy their first home. And to deal with this, we said, why don't we make it a lottery? Everybody below certain income levels gets one ticket, if you will, when they apply. But people who've lived in neighborhoods that are the very lowest income neighborhoods of the state, the most deteriorated neighborhoods of the state, who live in them for 5 of the last 10 years, they get 4 tickets. Doesn't matter what their race is,
Yeah.
doesn't matter anything else. So that's one of the approaches that I've worked on.
Yeah, that sounds very, very interesting. Long Island has tried similar things with their Fair Housing Council, where they had lotteries for people to get an affordable home. I mean, because if you're talking about metro areas nowadays on the East Coast or the West Coast, a small starter home is now a million or close to
Right.
$1 million. Um, when the vets returned home after World War II, there were huge housing initiatives like Levittown on Long
Yes.
Island and also in Pennsylvania. Why don't we do something like that today? Why aren't there, taking areas that are undeveloped or underdeveloped and building homes en masse like we did post World War II?
The average size of a new single family home in this country has doubled in the last 30 years
Yeah.
because builders make even the same percentage profit on a higher priced home.
Mhm.
So one of the things we've worked with several states on is the notion of providing basically infrastructure grants to cover the costs for developers of building the extra cost of building moderate income homes so they can make the same return. But I'd like to maybe step back from today to talk for a minute about this connection between freedom and housing because it impacts what tools are available. I mean, for example, 5 years ago, Senator Rubio and the Republicans sponsored a bill in Congress they called the Freedom to Zone Act, right? That freedom consisted of the right to exclude people from a community, to have a community all with the same kinds of people. It's that notion of freedom. And where does this come from? It comes from the 1960s, at a time when, after after World War II, realtors, who were the gatekeepers of American neighborhoods, started allowing Jews, Italians, um, Russians, and so forth to be considered white, to be allowed in. But the people who were left behind, the people who couldn't leave the original older mixed race areas of cities, were only African Americans. That's why you wound up with all black ghettos. They weren't sent to some place. This was simply everybody had lived in the world before zoning, in the world before the beginning of the 20th century. Everybody lived in mixed race areas in North and South. That was just the way it was because there was no group to enforce it. And yet the realtors, within about a dozen years, created this whole system that by the early 1960s, blacks were excluded from 98% of new homes in this country and 95% of neighborhoods. So the civil rights movement and the one Supreme Court victory said, well, we have to do something about it. So they proposed fair housing laws. And these started getting passed in various states. And the realtors almost everywhere bitterly opposed them because this was exactly the opposite of what they had, their rules and what they had done for 50 years. So in California, which is where half the realtors in the country were, in 1963, they passed a mild fair housing law, $500 penalty if you discriminated. It had dealt with 80 cases in its first year. The realtors organization, had to decide how to respond to this. In Massachusetts and Colorado, realtors said, we'll try and make this work. In California, however, they put a proposition, a state constitutional amendment on the ballot, one that's reshaped American politics. And this initiative said neither the state nor any city can ever limit your right to sell to who or rent to whomever you want. In other words, it would formally authorize discrimination and prevent any fair housing. And they were in a situation, the realtors were in a situation in which they were very politically isolated. Remember, this is the federal civil rights bill, this is the height of the civil rights movement, the height of liberalism in America. This Proposition 64 on the ballot at the same time Johnson won 60% of the vote, Goldwater 40%. And not the Chamber of Commerce, their longtime ally, would support them. All the archbishops were against this proposition. No politician in California or country, major politician, not Barry Goldwater, not Ronald Reagan, would touch this because it would be seen as being racist. So how did the realtors create a campaign that would make, would create another argument that wouldn't be seen as racial? And they created this idea of freedom of choice. And this is what was on billboards all on, Los Angeles freeways. And they said, to choose is to discriminate is to choose between two things. And this is American freedom, the freedom to choose. And they said, we're in favor, this is where colorblind freedom came, we're in favor of equal rights for all. For black owners and for white owners. What were those equal rights? They were the right to discriminate. That was the right that they were fighting for. And they created a whole, I went to the National Realtors Association, who has all these materials. They created nationally for this campaign in California that was supposed to turn the tide in the country, an 1.5-inch thick folder called a Forced Housing Action Kit. Instead of calling it fair housing, they always called it forced housing, like zoning was forced. And in this kit, it laid out 5-minute speeches, 10-minute speeches, 12-minute speeches, press releases, a whole kit that could be used in any city in the country to fight fair housing. You just have to fill in the name of the city. And what did this kit say? It said, never speak about race, only speak about freedom. Don't attack, other races. Say the problem is government, that government is taking your freedom. And what they did is they took a narrow right, something that nobody had ever talked about, like your right to sell a home, not to the highest bidder, but to choose not to. They took this right and said that was the basis of the American Revolution. That was what the purpose of America was for. And this was a very powerful argument that turned out to reshape America, because in the light of the Goldwater debacle, you wound up with conservatives needing a new way of presenting themselves. And this notion of freedom could appeal and could be used both for white Democrats who were turning Republican in the South, an alliance basically that had been forecast in 1948 by Charles Wallace Collins, a racist banker in the South. He said, if we're going to stop civil rights in this country and preserve our way of life, we have to create a new single party of white Southern Democrats and of Northern Republicans who would work with them, who would agree the aim is to prevent the federal government from regulating business and from regulating civil rights. This party was possible now in 1964, and Goldwater, the only votes he won were in the states he won were in the South. But you needed an argument that could be presented, had to be seen as racially neutral, and can work in both the South and North. This proposition, the realtors campaign had been so successful, they won 75% of the vote, 80% of the white vote.
Wow.
In California. So if they could win there, they could win anywhere. So 2 years later, when Reagan is running for governor and the state Supreme Court says this proposition was unconstitutional, he makes this the centerpiece of his campaign. He adopts this language. He's an amateur starting, trying to find a message. He adopts this language of homeowner rights. And this then becomes the central ideology of what's a new Republican Party. In 1964, 80% of Republicans, much higher than Democrats, voted for the Civil Rights Act and voted for the Voting Rights Act. So this was a new party. And at the heart of it, it was a way of combining two ideas of conservatism. This is what the Realtors message had laid out a way to do. And one was there were social conservatives, often Catholic, we should have school prayer, Sunday laws, so forth. And there were libertarians who said government shouldn't restrict anything. So it used the language of individual freedom, as your private property rights, like a house, like it's your house with your picket fence around. It used the language of individual freedom to enforce, to say you have the right, that your freedom effectively means the right to a conforming community where everybody lives by your rules. And that was why that language was so powerful. And they took, as I said, the single narrow right that everyone talked about before. They said, this is the litmus test of American freedom. If you take this right away, government will take away all your rights. This same technique could then be, and they never mentioned people's right to choose where to live or to buy a home or to rent. This technique of taking this single narrow right and making a litmus test could then be used on abortion, on guns, on campaign contributions. And you had all these special interest groups in the country, but what united them was the same language of freedom. And so at the heart of this, and what shifted America to the right, in the 1960s, freedom in America meant the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King spoke about freedom 20 times, March from Washington, once about equality. Freedom was an issue of opening doors. Freedom instead got used to mean the opposite of that. And that's what's had such and it's driven the Republican Party narrower and narrower toward only those who took, this view. So that's how I think these two fundamental features of America were both created by the same organization for the same purpose, as inventions, as invented as the airplane, carefully put together, both segregation and this language of American freedom. And they work hand in hand. And as I said, it would have taken enormous government action to overcome the legacy of segregation. But this language and this support and this shift in the country has made that impossible. And I think, so that's at the heart of, these are two basic features of America that distinguish it from other countries. And these got created together. They didn't have to be this way. This is something that got specifically created.
Fascinating. It's almost like clever marketing. Let's not market it as
Yes,
discrimination. Let's not market it as racism. Let's market it as freedom. And then all of the other entities, such as the gun lobby and even the cigarette lobby, latched onto it. I've got a freedom to smoke, you know?
right. Or the Koch brothers,
Yeah.
and all these campaigns have been focused on this throughout.
Yeah, fascinating. It is a terrific read, folks. It is called Freedom to Discriminate. It's written by housing expert Gene Slater. In the book, he reveals how realtors played a pivotal role in segregating communities, influencing policy, and redefining the very concept of freedom in America. And that is the part we should underscore here because it is a fascinating thesis, and I think it would be hard to prove untrue.
Could
Gene,
I,
thank
could
you.
I, could I just add
Yep.
one more word? What I come to in the book from this sort of narrative history is the realization there are two opposite meanings of freedom in this country. One was specifically created in the 1960s to oppose the other, and one is exclusive freedom, your right to exclude, a
Mhm.
right that belongs only to certain people. Um, and the other is inclusive freedom from the Declaration of Independence, where government is created to secure these rights, to make certain nobody dominates another, to balance the rights like freedom of speech and freedom of press. And the whole purpose of this idea of exclusive freedom, and those terms ought to be used to
Mhm.
distinguish this, the whole purpose was to go back and maintain conformity. That was its purpose.
To go back and maintain what?
Um, Maintain community traditions,
Mm.
to say you have the right to live in a community where everybody follows, it has to live by your rules and
Or
other
looks
people
alike.
can't live. Right. And if you give those rights to other people, people who don't look like you,
Yeah.
then you're taking away your freedom.
Amazing. Amazing. It's an amazing pitch. It's an amazing twist of reasoning in many ways, but it's also amazing that most of America, or a lot of America, has bought into it hook, line, and sinker, as they used to say. Gene, thank you so much for joining me here today on Spotlight.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.